You're listening to the VBMA podcast.
Hello, everyone. It has been a while, but we are back. And today I was lucky enough to chat with some very esteemed individuals. Dr. Sam Morello joined us to talk about an amazing paper she wrote regarding the pay of interns. She has a plethora of experience on professional and economic issues in the field, so we were lucky to hear from her today. Also joining us is the current 2022 National VBMA Vice President, Joe Thurston. Working with Dr. Morello on the paper and having a student perspective, he was able to shed some light on the issues at hand. So, buckle up, everyone, and enjoy this latest episode. So I'm not...
Okay, cool. We'll stick with it then.
Yeah, all right. Well, we'll kind of just hop right into it. So thank you for joining me, Dr. Morello and Joe. Obviously, we want to talk about the study that you wrote, the comparison of resident and intern salaries with the current living wage as a quantitative estimate of financial strain among postgraduate veterinary trainees. We will hopefully we'll break down that title a little bit later.
Yeah, it's quite a title. Yeah,
it's impressive, as Dr. Rourke said, right? Now, kind of just for listeners to get a backstory, Dr. Morello, I'd love to hear you, where you came from, how you got to writing this paper, and then Joe, how did you get involved? How did you meet? I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, so I can start. I'm a large animal surgeon by training, which has nothing to do with researching economics, of course, but I developed an interest in sort of the social science side of veterinary medicine actually a number of years ago now, and started doing research sort of in that area, looking at sort of the variety of things, the interaction between sort of personal lives and professional lives, work-life integration, families, decision-making, and a lot of that ends up having to do with economics, right? Income generation, how we do it, how much people generate, things that intersect with that and influence that, working environments, gender, race, all of those things. And so one of the things that is a huge topic in veterinary medicine, of course, is income, is student debt and income, is the various professional paths you can go down in income. And so it's clear that one of the big bottlenecks in career choices is that point where you decide, am I going to do an internship in a residency or am I not? Because that financial constraint of making that choice can be a big part of that decision-making process for some people. Not for everybody, but certainly for some people, it can be quite a stressor. And so it's been a topic I've been interested in studying for a long time. That financial strain can lead to a lot of things, which I think we're going to discuss in that podcast, so I won't start drilling down on that here. And the question really for me was, well, how am I going to study that? We all know that not a lot of money is not a lot of money, but how do we quantify that? And after kind of thinking about it for a really long time, I stumbled upon the tool that we used in our study, the MIT Living Wage Calculator, which gave me a really nice method of quantitatively being able to show in various places, how much or really how little income people were making. And, I also have to say, one of the things that motivated me to really get it done when I got it done was personal. A friend and a family member of a very, very, very close friend of mine, Dr. Josh Smith, died by suicide, actually almost exactly a year ago now. And financial strain played a large role in what happened with him and the stressors he was experiencing. And it was just a reawakening of the inspiration to tackle this concept. So never long or never short-winded with me here. So I'm going to pass this over to Joe.
Yeah, and so I knew of Dr. Morello from I think one of our clubs had hosted an event with her about the gender gap research that she had done, and then she gave the same presentation at the VBMA national meeting in 2021. So I had heard a couple of her presentations, and then for 2021, I was on the executive board of our local VBMA here, and she had reached out because she was planning this thing with someone from Royal Canin about student debt, personal finance, and like, hey, would the VBMA like to be involved with this? And I'm like, yeah, right up the VBMA's alley for sure. So she and I worked on that a little bit and talked a little bit at that event, and then later in the semester, I think she emailed me about like, hey, like, I know you're involved in the VBMA. I'm looking at doing this research project. Would you like to help out? And I was like, yeah, that sounds awesome. And then she explained it a little more, and I think it was really resonated with me because in just veterinary, school, right, you get exposed to all of these, internship opportunities, residency opportunities, and there's always a little caveat at the end, be like, yeah, you don't make that much money during it. And so it was always like, I was interested in learning more about like, okay, now exactly like what is that like pay gap in that area, and then as well just exploring like the whole conversation around internships and what benefits they do provide to students, and then what like kind of drawbacks there are to them as well.
Yeah, no, thank you, Joe. And Dr. Morello, before moving forward, I want to just kind of express I appreciate you sharing that with us about your friend, and I'm very sorry for that. But that is real. That's something that we see chronically in veterinary medicine, and that's really unfortunate. Something I kind of want to unpack a little bit more is the concept of students, no matter what, doing a residency if they want to do one or internship, and they know that they're not going to get paid that much, and they know they might have to take out another loan because if you're in New York or San Francisco or somewhere expensive, that $30,000 a year isn't going to do much. So what do you see with students kind of taking that on in terms of knowing, like willingly doing so? How do you see that shifting? Is it staying the same? What do you have for that?
What I've seen shift over time. So I graduated veterinary school in 2006. And at that time, for most people, you did one and sometimes two internships before you got into a residency. And it was fairly normal to do two internships, but it wasn't necessarily expected. And today, I think it's fairly expected that you will have to do about two internships before you do, I don't know, at least some of the more competitive residencies like surgery or radiology or neurology or some of those things, right? And it's becoming more and more the norm that you might even have to do three. And it can become this endless cycle because it's not like you're guaranteed to get into that residency program, right? It's not like it's not the human world where there are sort of an equal number of residency programs to internship programs and people who are finishing school. So it's this carrot that gets dangled. And the advice, I think, of a lot of programs is, okay, well, go do this internship next, or go do this research program next, or go do whatever, and then you'll be a better candidate, without the golden ticket necessarily being there at the end. And for some for some residencies, there is a golden ticket, right? You are going to make that money back. But for some residencies, it's not a golden ticket. It's you getting to do what you want to do. And it's hard to put a value on that, but you have to live with the debt you've incurred at the end of it. And that's not something that's discussed through those years of, we'll go do this internship and then go do another one. That's not part of that sort of mentorship process of, well, just so you know, if you take another year to do this, why don't you calculate what that debt load's going to be after that compounding effect, and after another year of, maybe, as you said, needing to take out some more loans. And we can't guarantee everybody residency training, which isn't to say that you should necessarily have to, quote unquote, give up on your dreams if your dreams are to, cure dogs of neurological diseases or fix TPLOs all day or whatever it is. But I don't think that we do the other side of it, which is talk about what those costs can be, both financial and to your personal life, right? Like, what is the cost of having to travel that road the way the road has become? And so again, the evolution is that it has gotten harder to walk that path in some ways. Those paths have gotten somewhat longer, and it's not always, you don't always get paid back for doing it. And so I think there just needs to be better education and more education. And maybe there should be limits. Maybe there should be limits to what that is, because it also segregates really the people who can walk those paths, or who have the ability to walk those paths, or the positions we place the people who can make it through in once they actually come out.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and I think that's kind of hard to maintain as well. And when you two were doing this study, how did you break down like the logistics of it? How were you able to collect the data, collect the numbers? Were you just reaching out to all the residency programs in the United States, because we all know there's not that many of them, or how did that look?
Yeah, so there's the match, right? The veterinary internship and matching program has a bunch of different residencies and internships listed on there. And so we were able to go on that website, and then we would, pull the data basically from there. I think it was about 150 residencies and internship, like each 150 of each, for over a couple different specialties. And so most of them listed salary data. So we would collect that salary data for the first year. And then what we compared it to was, like Dr. Morello had talked about a little earlier, was the MIT living wage calculator, which is this cool tool that like takes the area, that basically takes zip code and the area you're in, and then it calculates the annual required income that you need to be able to purchase like basic living expenses. And so I think they define it, right? It's like the minimum income level that, like, if you meet that level, draws a line between like needing public assistance programs, so like food stamps and stuff like that. So then we would compare that. They have it at a annual income rate, and they have it at an hourly living wage as well. So then we basically compared those two numbers together.
Okay, very nice. And I know I read the study, but this is for people who haven't heard it or haven't read it yet. What were the numbers like from living wages, like based on what you need to survive? Where did the residency and intern wages land on that spectrum?
Yeah, so it was for what like the data that we collected, we called it an income surplus, and that's where we subtracted the the living wage requirement minus the hourly wage that they were getting paid, or the annual income that they got for the residency. And with that, for the residencies, there were, I think it was 15% of all residencies had a negative income surplus. So basically those residencies weren't paying students enough to subsist on, to live on. And for internships, it was even worse. It was 22% of all of those internships weren't meeting the basic requirements for the students in their area. And that's just at the basic 40 hours a week kind of annual income rate. It gets a lot worse when you take a look and break it down by hourly wage. So one of the things we looked at is there was a study done by, I think, the AAVMC that would like calculated how many hours their residents and interns worked. And they said both residents and interns, it was about 60 hours a week. So then we compared the data at their annual rate divided by 60 hours a week, and compared that against the hourly living wage that MIT gave. And that was, I think, 85% of all residencies and 92% of all internships weren't paying an hourly living wage. So it was a bleak, to say the least.
This is going to get me all fired up. So I think another question that I have is, this isn't new, and it isn't necessarily unique to veterinary medicine, right? Getting paid complete dog crap for internships and residencies. I have family members, and they tell me when they were going through their internships and residencies that they made like $12,000 a year back in the 80s, or that people who were working at fast food restaurants next to them were making more hourly, kind of like what you were hitting on earlier, Joe. And I'm wondering where it's going to go, because in veterinary medicine right now, at least from my perspective, we're seeing this really big shift in how things are ran. Like people aren't settling as much for bad pay anymore. People aren't going to take it. So do you think that in the future, with the boom of veterinary medicine the last couple of years, do you think we're going to see an increase in it? And why do you think we still just pay interns and residents terrible money and just tell them they have to work hard and grit their teeth and, grow thicker bark?
I think that's a good question. It's actually two questions in one, so I'll answer both and I'll flip it. I'll answer first, why do I think that we are paying the same way we've always paid? And I think that is the answer. I think we just were doing things one way a long time ago. And I think we just kind of kept doing them. But I think the hopeful answer is what you've already alluded to, which is that we're seeing a boom in veterinary medicine. And that gives us a great opportunity to rethink the way that we're doing things. I think, one of the things that we found in our paper, which is an interesting thing to think about, is there was a difference between the way people compensated in academia versus private practice, right? One of the reasons for the boom in academia is sort of the rise in corporate practices and the way that they've been able to compensate and restructure compensation. Academic systems are limited for a variety of reasons that are not entirely their own fault, right? The way university systems operate, state funding, all of that. And so they're just more slower. They just change more slowly, which doesn't mean that they won't change. But they compensate at a higher rate for both their interns and their residents. And we showed that statistically. It's good business, right? It's remaining competitive. And it's also providing good opportunities to good people, which helps attract and retain their future specialists, which is something that a lot of those businesses want to be able to do. It's what every employer of specialists should want to be able to do at this point in time. I think one of the things that we're seeing already out in that space, if we look at some companies like Veg and like Blue Pearl, and I think VCA is running this program now as well. They're creating alternative sort of training programs, alternative sort of boot camp and tracks. They're not called internships, but they're basically like a big accelerated internship program. Many of them, I think, are focused on urgent care and emergent care training, but it's an alternative way to provide postgraduate training and education, which is really something that we should be able to focus on, right? We don't all come out of veterinary school perfectly trained and ready to go. Many of us want that environment, want that learning environment, that mentorship environment, that training environment, and internships are an incredible place to get that. And so where else can we go if we don't have the ability to make the choice to only make X number of dollars a year? And these companies have started to create these other educational opportunities that aren't limited by the same sort of financial constraints. And so that's where I'd like to see, I personally would like to see training programs in general go, that we're not limiting career choices by finances. And it doesn't mean that internships and residencies are suddenly going to pay $100,000, right? There's a cost to education. And for many of these programs, there is a financial payoff later on, but it shouldn't be a cost that means you have to take out more debt. That means you can't, pay for your own medical expense if you have something happen to you. If your car breaks down, that you can't afford to pay for that. If your pet has a medical need that you can't afford to pay for that, it shouldn't be that low level of an issue that you can't afford. So there's going to need to be a happy medium even for the programs that already exist, and people are going to have to rise to that occasion.
Yeah, and I think that's I like what you're saying about, wanting to have basic needs of sorts. Like I always tell people, I want to be able to take my kids on vacation once a year. And like the fact that a couple years ago in vet medicine, that was something that like you had to think about is crazy to me. Another question I'd like to kind of throw at y'all is I'm wondering where the threshold is between, let's say light switch flipped, and tomorrow we can now pay veterinarians coming out into their internships and residencies, almost six figures. What I'm wondering if there is a point in which, if people will work harder, if they're paid more, and will they be happier for that? And I keep trying to think about that a lot because, after going through vet school, you just put yourself through 4 years of, a grinder and you're trying to come out and make sure you're getting what you're worth. And do you think that there's a limit to that amount of money, like a cap for how much those types of people should make when they first come out? Because we need training. I know I'm going to be horrified when I come out of vet school because I'm going to feel like I don't know anything. Kind of like you're saying, mentorship, huge right now. So where do you see that? Where do you see that going?
I do think that there is a number, and I don't pretend to know what the number is. I think that there are ways to figure out that number. I think what we tried to do in the paper was use other groups, right? You said we're not the only group that provides this sort of postgraduate training. So we looked at what groups like the National Institute of Health pays their postgraduate trainees, who are people who have already achieved doctorates in science. And we looked at medical residents who are also, contributing to the care of patients and the economy through their own practice of medicine, but also undergoing training. And those are individuals who are making in the mid to high 50s and low 60s. And that's a amount of money that, nobody's getting rich on, but people are also not starving on. And I think that's a good anchoring point for us to start this conversation. And then also make sure, as those organizations are both doing, that it gets rethought on an annual basis based on, what is the cost of living in this country and in regional areas every year. Inflation happens, so that it continues to meet the needs of those individuals and allows them to live the way that they need to. I think those are programs that are subsidized by the federal government, as our programs aren't. And we should also recognize that in veterinary medicine, interns and residents help contribute to the generation of revenue in our hospital systems. I know that during the pandemic, I would not have been able to run my clinical services if it wasn't for my interns and residents who were helping us to survive. And I'd like for us to help understand what role they do play. As much as education costs some money and time, it also provides services, right? It supports doctors, it supports education in its own way too. And I think we have to acknowledge that and at least start to try to understand what that economic figure is to help support at least to help corroborate that investment in those salaries.
Yeah, and I think that the field is changing so rapidly, especially right now, that it's kind of hard to see where it's going to land and plateau next, and we don't know. So Joe, forgot to mention this. Joe is also currently the vice president of the National VBMA. So we have two big wigs on with us. But something that I was thinking about while you were talking, Dr. Morello, is that the VBMA, harps on teaching veterinary students about business, knowing your worth. One of the big things in one of our categories is contract negotiation, which is huge because I didn't even know you could negotiate a contract when I got into vet school. I didn't know that was a thing, and now I negotiate every contract I get. But that's besides the point. When veterinary students are now applying for residencies and internships, do you think it's appropriate, or do you think that they can negotiate those contracts that they're getting from those companies? Like, do you think that that's possible with the way the field is going? Because that's something that's got my brain kind of churning a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point as well. Something to consider. I think currently the way it's set up with the match program and with kind of like the marketplace that is currently set up, where everyone is striving, at least a lot of the vet students are like striving to get these coveted internships, coveted residencies, where they currently, the interns or the internship programs, the residency programs hold a lot of the power in the negotiation process. And I think that, if you're talking broad scale economics, might be part of the reason for the depressed internships and resident salaries, because there's very little leverage from the other side. But I think with, like we've talked about already, with all of these new mentorship programs or training programs that private practice is doing, where it's like, hey, come work here for, the first 6 months will basically be teaching you, but paying you still like a normal salary. I think that's where the students might be able to gain some of that leverage back, where there's now other alternatives to an internship and residency that, while they might not provide the same level of training as an internship, right? Because the internship's kind of the gold standard for how, your post vet school training. But I have this other option where I can go get, 70% of the training, but get paid, significantly more than I get paid at an internship. But that kind of negotiation might, give some of that power back in that negotiation. So it's an interesting point.
Yeah, I was definitely trying to think on that, because you make a good point. If we know anything about humans and people in power, is that they leverage it to their ability as best as they can. And I'm sure that a lot of big programs do that. And so, if you match with the program and you tell them like, oh, like I actually want $80,000, they're going to be like, we're going to go find the next person. What do you think about that, Dr. Morello?
I think that both of the points that you're making are great, and that you're right. It's extraordinarily difficult for a single intern or resident to go back to a program and try to negotiate that, but that the larger market should start being able to shift because of what you're seeing. There's an overall decreasing number of people entering into or applying for internship programs. And I even believe, I recently heard there was some data that number is translating into residency applicants as well. And so it should become really incumbent upon those offering those programs to start saying, well, what's the competition, right? What are the competitive markets that those individuals are entering? And honestly, the best negotiators are the one who offer the more competitive benefits rather than waiting for somebody to come ask, right? Who offer a better salary, who offer better benefits instead of waiting for somebody to come and have to ask for them. That's a better retention or recruitment process. And so that gets to some of the bigger issues here, some of the bigger 10,000 foot perspective questions, which is, at the end of the day, you're going to get what you offer, or you're going to attract what you offer. So I think there will always be people who want to do internships and want to do residencies, and that's great. And the question will be, who are the people that you're attracting at the end of the day, if you're not changing what you are offering? And so you want to, arguably you want some of the best people everywhere, right? You want some of the best people going into GP. You want some of the best people going into industry, some of the best people becoming surgeons, and others neurologists, and others internists. But you want everything to be attractive enough so that you get the best people going in those directions. And when you have a really unequal set of opportunities, that's not going to be what you get. And it's not also about, quote unquote, the quality of the applicant. It's about all the other sort of demographics of those applicants. So right now, you talked about wanting to take your family on vacation, right? And so when you have a salary of $30-something thousand, I think the average resident salary overall was in the high 30s, and it was a little bit higher for private practice and a little bit lower for academia. You're not taking your family on vacation there, right? And so that's a big detractor for individuals who have children or who want to have children. And some of the other benefit structures as far as family leave and healthcare in general for families, and how much those residency programs pay into full family benefits, not that competitive, right? So it's not particularly attractive to young veterinarians, especially in a lot of senses female veterinarians who have children or who want to have children. And then you can get into the discussion about other diversity issues, right? So Lisa Greenhill at the AAVMC has put out some really great data about the proportion of Black, Indigenous, people of color who come into veterinary school already carrying debt and also carrying higher amounts of debt in comparison to their white classmates. And so the threshold for being able to take on a lower amount of income and a lower amount of income for a prolonged period of time, if you're going to do internships and residencies, may be different for that group, right? We already see that it's a much lower proportion of specialists who are not white. Those individuals end up going into academia where we have an overrepresentation of white faculty. So it's another bottleneck in the whole diversity and inclusion discussion that we've been having at a much broader level for the last 2 years. And finances play a role in diversity and inclusion. They play a big implicit role. And finances create a bottleneck for various underrepresented groups for a variety of reasons. And so this gets back to your question about negotiations, because some of the concept of negotiation is about who you attract and who you retain. And they're not going to attract or retain that sort of more diverse applicant group without changing what they have to negotiate with. So that was my long-winded answer.
That's a good point. I like that you tied it together with a bow at the end there. That was good. So another question for you, Dr. Morello, have you seen, in terms of diversity, have you seen that change at all over the last 2 years? Have you seen, a greater number of, more diverse individuals getting into specialties, or has that been staying pretty stagnant over the last couple of years?
So there's no way to determine that at the moment, because up until this past cycle, nobody has collected data on that. The VIRMP has not collected data on their, they collected data on, I think, the gender of their applicants, but never on the race or ethnicity of their applicants. But this past VIRMP cycle, they did. So we're going to at least know one data point on it. The specialty colleges also have not collected data historically on race or ethnicity. So we have no longitudinal accounting of how that has changed over time. So my answer is, I personally can't say I have observed it much. Large animal surgery is one of the more poorly performing areas for diversity. So I can't say that, having sat behind the desk and looked at my applicant pool, it's been an impressive shift over time. But I'm hopeful that with the data collection, not only will we see a change because we're collecting the data, it will incentivize more progressivism in what we attract and also how people are choosing their candidates.
I think I am also very excited to see where this field goes in the next 10 years, because I am a huge fan of people standing up for what they're worth and, getting paid for what they deserve. Like you mentioned veg earlier, technicians are leaving their jobs and going to veg because they are backed by private equity and they're getting paid $45 an hour instead of $20 an hour. And I think it's hard because you have all these people in the veterinary industry that always just know they're not going to make as much, and they're just extremely passionate about the field, and that's why they do it. And it doesn't matter how much money they make. But if you can get them to understand that they are worth more, and maybe that they can take their kids on vacation if they go work for this company, or if they ask for more money. And I think that's going to be a huge shift that we see in the next decade. I forgot who said it, but somebody said we're on the fifth year of a 50-year boom in veterinary medicine. And I want to say it was someone high up in Blue Pearl, but I think that's great. And kind of to wrap this all up, I know that you all have a lot of ideas, and your paper has been awesome. How do you think if you had to guess, we're not going to quote anybody on being right here, but how do you think we can fix this problem? How do you think we can fix the money issue? We have this overarching problem. how's it going to get fixed, and is it being fixed?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different ways that this can be done, and I'll offer up maybe some of my thoughts, and then Dr. Morello can offer up some of hers as well. But I think one of them we touched on, right, is figuring out how we recognize the value of interns and residents and what they bring to the programs they're in. Because currently it's kind of a one-sided affair, but we talk about production all the time. We're talking about veterinarians and hey, you track all of this. And I think private practice might be a little more equipped to handle this than academia, but like tracking what interns do on a daily basis and what they bring into the company, I think could be a way for them to understand a little more of their value and figure that out and then compensate them appropriately for that. I think in all industries, right, where besides finances, I think kind of getting creative with the benefits outside of just pure salary compensation. So because there are a lot of costs, like we talked about, involved in having an internship program and having a residency program, where especially some of the academic programs, they can't afford, for a variety of reasons, to pay interns and residents what private practice is paying them. But what they can do is they can offer like a subsidized housing program and a different perks in terms of like membership to the university's gym and stuff like that, where they're providing other benefits that limit a lot of the other stressors that go along with, because poor financial compensation leads to all kinds of different stresses. But if you're limiting, like, hey, we're giving them easy access to housing, we're providing different food subsidy plans, or providing them with easy ways for them to exercise and get fulfillment in other areas, that could be one solution that we could implement in the very short term. Like that's kind of a short-term solution that could work towards that goal of fixing the problem, so to speak. I'll let Dr. Morello just throw some of her options out there as well.
I like that, Joe. That was good. I would have never thought of that. Fix the small things early, and you can do that quick.
Yeah, because I think, like we talked about, right, the market will hopefully start to correct some of these broader term issues, right? And over time, like how much interns and residents get paid is a long-term solution, right? Like we can't necessarily be like, yeah, we're going to double our intern salary tomorrow. That's very rare cases where that can happen. But I think some of that, hopefully we'll work towards that in the long term. In the short term, there's a lot of things we can do as well.
I mean, I think you guys actually summarized the most important concept, which is recognizing the value of people. This article was about interns and residents, which ultimately specialists represent about 10% of the workforce. And that's important, but that's still only 10% of the workforce that we're shunting in that direction. That leaves another 90%. And that still doesn't even talk about technicians. And some of the biggest bottlenecks in our profession today, actually the biggest bottleneck in our profession today, may be the technician workforce crisis, right? And burnout among, general practitioners. Making sure that we're thoughtful about recognizing the value of everybody that works in veterinary medicine, and that I think that private equity investment has done a lot to help veterinary medicine, and we can debate the pros and cons of that. But as we do that, making sure we don't stratify who's doing great and who's not doing great, continuing to recognize the value, and as Joe just said, trying to really discern who is keeping the day going, who's getting those animals in the door, making sure they're taken care of and getting them out the door, and trying to help quantify that a little bit better, from the receptionist up front to the technician to the intern to the specialist, everybody. I think that that's an important part of the process as we continue to have that boom, and make sure everybody is supported. And then that secondary component of it, the unseen sort of, or the less well quantified compensation, the benefit structures, making sure that they remain strong and well distributed. And for academia, which does not have the economic model that private practice and certainly private equity does, finding different ways to help support and compensate those individuals, and also finding different ways to subsidize those programs through some of the state funding that comes through, which is how a lot of the faculty get compensated, helping to subsidize programs that way, which is how the majority of postgraduate training is subsidized in other areas of science, could be beneficial to help support those programs, because that's where the majority of interns and residents, certainly the majority of interns, residents, not interns, but the majority of those interns get paid. I think that the overarching theme should be, when we talk about interns and residents, that education is the most important, and we need to make sure that finances don't get in the way of education, right? They've gotten in the way of veterinary education because costs are so high. Student debt's a problem. They're getting in the way of postgraduate education and career choices because compensation is so low. It's become this imbalanced thing, and that's an unfairness that we don't want to get in the way for people. We want education to continue to come first, and unfortunately, we're creating a space where finances are coming first for too many people.
I could not agree more. It makes me worried about my kids wanting to go to college one day, but we won't unpack that right now. That's a whole other can of worms. But Dr. Morello, Joe, I appreciate you both hopping on to talk about your paper. I'm going to put a link in our bio on Instagram and on the episode to share it. I think everybody should give it a read. Very helpful to put things in perspective. And like you both said, it might be time to kind of figure out what the value is of new grads. I think that's really important. But thank you again for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us on.
Yeah.